So who are you and what do you do within the space of money?
Sure. So my
Yeah.
name is Lana Swartz, and I
Mhm.
am an assistant professor of media studies at the University of Virginia. I am also this year a fellow at the Berggruen Institute, which is supposed to be which is in Southern California, but I am remote from Virginia to Southern California through January at least. So hopefully I'll be able to get out there this year. I just published a book called New Money, how payment became social media, which, yeah, yay. I'll virtually sign it for
Yeah.
you if I can.
Yeah.
And thank you for having me on your YouTube show or whatever.
Yeah. No
uh,
doubt. Yeah.
yeah. Yeah, which just came out from Yale University
Mhm.
Press. Um, and it argues that we should understand money as
Mhm.
or one way that we can understand money is as a communication and media technology, and that by doing so, it can kind of open up new stories, new forms of meaning, new forms of power, new forms of counterpower, new politics, and it traces the idea of looking at money as a media technology historically, which then I hope sets up a pretty in-depth discussion of emerging technologies and emerging financial technologies and their social and cultural um, uh, consequences.
Mm.
So before that, I edited with Bill Maurer a book called Paid Tales of Dongles, Checks, and Other Money Stuff.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love. Yeah.
Yay! Which brought together scholars and journalists and industry
Mm.
folks, mostly scholars across fields, to just write these short, punchy, like 2,000 word essays with lots of pretty
Mm.
pictures about the stuff of money. Um, and other than that, I've published articles on Bitcoin and blockchain and other financial
Mhm.
technologies. So I've been looking at this stuff, at the idea of money as media, for almost a decade now,
Mhm.
uh, and and yeah, I'm yeah excited to have my first monograph recently.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, I read it and it's great. So I mean, like, we're gonna get to that quickly, but I
Thanks.
guess I just wanted to hear maybe your personal story as how you got into writing so much about money and Bitcoin and payment. So how did you get into all this stuff?
Yeah. So
Why are you
I
interested in it?
Yeah. So I started, I did a master's at MIT, which finished in 2009. And in that master's, which was a master's in comparative media studies, I was studying, I was, I had two major projects, one of which was looking at social media and all the changes it was bringing socially and culturally, particularly as it relates to education. And the other, which was my master's thesis, was about counterfeit luxury goods, so like fake Louis Vuitton bags and all of that. And the reason why I was interested in that is I was pretty interested in how new technology and new forms of global communication was destabilizing copyright regimes and intellectual
Mhm.
property regimes and ownership regimes of ownership and authorship. And there, at the time, was quite a bit of research going on about intellectual property and new media. But I felt like it was pretty focused on code, pretty focused on music, and was kind of I guess you could say like a boys club. And so I was interested in kind of a feminist intervention into that space that looked at something as kind of frivolous as fashion, and
Mm.
tried to look at how it potentially destabilized some of the meta narratives that were forming around changes to ownership and authorship.
Mhm.
And so I studied communities of folks online who were connoisseurs of counterfeit fakes.
Mm.
And the kind of global supply chain of those fakes, kind of the
Interesting.
relational supply chain. And so I became really fascinated in the context of media studies. So, in the context of understanding um, new media and new technology and its relationship to society and culture,
Mhm.
I started study. what was I talking about? I lost my train of thought.
We're
Yeah,
talking about
so I
community.
studied
Yeah.
these online communities, and I became
Hmm.
really interested. And then also looking at the mechanisms through which they paid each other, so like how they
Mm.
actually bought and sold these illicit
Hmm.
goods. Um,
Yeah.
and so I became really interested in kind of the cultures of marketplaces,
Hmm.
and the cultures of marketplaces online and how they were
Mm.
emerging. So so even despite being a media studies scholar, I wound up reading quite a bit of economic anthropology, and the more kind of culturally inflected economic sociology. Then I mentioned, I finished my master's degree in
Mm.
2009. That was at that moment when suddenly, we were faced with the last most recent global economic
Mhm.
crisis, um, and so at the moment that I was really immersed in economic anthropology, suddenly a whole world of other folks became interested in kind of rethinking money and rethinking money with new technology. Um,
Mm.
so so, I always cite this one Onion article, that's
Yeah.
from around that time that says like, U.S. economy grinds to a halt as
Mm.
Fed officials, as everybody realizes that money is nothing more than
Yeah.
a shared illusion. And it really did kind of feel that way in 2008, 2010, and so
Mm.
on. There were there was so much creativity, whether that was, as Hannah Appel describes, the kind of
Mm.
Occupy Finance group, whether it was a variety of new kind of mutual aid organizations that kind of popped up or faced resurgence. And, the other thing about that moment, that 2009-ish historical conjuncture, was that it was also the tipping point for Facebook. So it was like the
Mm.
moment when everybody had Facebook. Like it wasn't just young people. It was like, everybody's sonograms and
Mhm.
everybody's grandmother. And so there was this kind of real tipping point that social media was absolutely here to stay.
Mhm.
And it was the debut of the Android phone and Apple phone. So suddenly
Mm.
everyone was carrying around this quite sophisticated computer in their pocket. And around that time, 2008-ish, was also, um, the moment when M-Pesa really,
Mhm. Yeah.
really became clear that it was going to be this like large scale, massive, successful mobile payment
Mm.
system. So it was this kind of moment where there was this diffusion of technology, um, high investment in technology, a shift
Mm.
in the kind of the locus of industrial imagination from kind of Wall Street to Silicon Valley, and a time when there was a kind of grassroots effort to kind of rethink money. Um, so there was a lot of optimism, a lot of excitement, all of which kind of settled into, potentially like less optimistic, less utopian kinds of of practices. So like, at that time the sharing economy was coming out, which very quickly became the kind of gig economy. And
Mhm.
Bitcoin was supposed to be this, anarcho, crypto, anarchist, cryptographic,
Mhm.
alternative, and sort of that settled into, what it is today. So it was the right moment historically to begin this project. I had I was looking at, and I was also like really interested and kind of well poised to begin
Mhm.
studying this. There haven't been as many scholars, and there weren't at the time, who were sort of bringing the kind of media studies, technology studies, STS, science and technology studies, infrastructure studies, um,
Mhm.
lens to looking at money. So
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting. I think it comes up a few times in your work, the coming of Silicon Valley post 2008, 9 into kind of money and payment system and kind of really reimagining it. I think that props up a lot of time in your book, which I found
mhm.
quite interesting. And yeah, I did. Yeah, I'm just looking at the quote here: "U.S. economy grinds to halt as nation
Yeah.
realizes money just symbolic, mutually shared illusion." Yeah.
Yeah, but the
Yeah.
other side of that, I mean, I think I always share that article with my
Mm.
students, and I use it in my book, and I use it in plenty
Mm.
of talks. But the flip side of that is, if you read the article, it
Mm.
describes this idea that money is an illusion,
Mm.
um, diffusing among the populace, like from
Mm.
then President Obama to a bank robber who realizes it's silly to rob a bank, to someone, um, who's about to get their home foreclosed on and the bank officer who's foreclosing on that home, both realizing it doesn't matter and kind of embracing. Um, and then everyone resolves in the article to say, oh, from now on, we're going to barter. We're just going to grow our
Mm-hmm.
own tomatoes. We're just going to start from scratch and we don't need
Mm-hmm.
this money thing. But then the author, the reporter says, oh, well, how are you going to do that? And kind of starts asking questions like,
Mm-hmm.
how many tomatoes does it take to get heart surgery? And we're left with this realization that money is
Mm-hmm.
nothing more than a shared illusion, but that it's a really useful one, and that it's one
Mm-hmm.
that requires a lot of coordination, a lot of it's may not be backed by anything, except it's backed by all technology, all global systems, and it's like relatively intractable. And to replace it
Yeah.
is easier said than done.
I mean, allegiance can be powerful and useful, right? As well. So I mean, so like, it was really interesting to hear about, the counterfeit stuff that you did and
Mm.
the work on community. And I was interested, maybe a good place to start from your book is perhaps not the most obvious place to start, but your emphasis on communities.
Mm.
Um, that you start with. Yeah, so why do you start from? I mean, your main question that you're unpacking, I guess, it's a simple question that you put forward, but then you unpack in complex way. Why is it easy to send, a digital message on Facebook, but not so easy to send money across?
Mhm.
And then you look into communities within the transactional world. You use the word, a phrase, transactional communities.
Mhm.
So why did you choose communities?
Mhm. Yeah. So I want to be clear. I do talk about transactional communities, and that's
Mm,
an idea that I take pains to develop throughout the book. But one thing I do want to be clear about is that I don't necessarily mean community in the kind of
mm,
romanticized, touchy-feely, like
mm,
communion sense of the word. I think that community is clearly quite loaded in the sense that it imagines cooperation and imagines like mutuality or networks of care, and I don't actually mean that. I mean,
mm.
although I don't, it could be, but that's
Yeah.
members of a transactional community may not relate to each other in that way.
Hmm.
I chose community because I think about community as a network or collectivity that
Hmm.
emerges through communication. So sort of
Mm,
through um, a shared communicative world. So the people and entities that you can communicate with, and and then therefore you um, this kind of communication of information, sharing of information produces some sense of a shared reality, kind of makes up the community. And I use a variety of communication scholars from John Dorn Peters to James Carey to kind of think through, how communication technologies function to kind of repair and reproduce, for good or
mm,
bad, a kind of like shared sense of the world. So I was in looking at money from the point of view of media technology, so thinking about it
mhm,
as a communication form. I think about Benedict Anderson, who argued
mhm,
that print culture produced this imagined community, or like the nation state as an imagined community, and that story that gets told about what print culture does, meaning newspapers, is very
mhm,
similar to what we can see the state issued currency in the form of print currency or paper currency as doing. So, you know, historians describe the emergence of French national currency as turning peasants into Frenchmen, and kind of suddenly
mhm,
allowing them to see themselves as a member of an economic community, the
mhm,
scope and scale and size of the nation state.
mhm,
Um, and there's and I think about Eric Hellener, who's a Canadian geographer who has written quite a bit about how national currencies create this kind of common economic language for members of the nation state as what I would call a transactional community to communicate with each other.
mhm,
And as such, it's a vector of officially sanctioned histories, of propaganda, of shared senses of the past, and therefore shared senses of the future. Um, so so it's pretty I think it's pretty clear that we can think about the ways that
Mm.
state issued paper currency produces a sense of a transactional community. So then, what then are we to make of the kind of future of transactional communities, of transactional communication, and the kind of totalities and collectivities that they form in a world where national currency is increasingly digitized and there are increasing attempts to untether money from the nation state? Or anyway, when we have a sense, at the very least, that citizenship is changing in some way, and notions of the the collectivities that we're part of are no longer simply local, and our kind of senses of ourselves are similarly
Mm.
not bound by geography.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned this, we touched on this as well. That like it's also quite good to think with throughout the book to imagine these like different communities interacting with each other, like
Mhm.
communicating to each other to highlight the different mechanisms at play within the book. Like that each chapter goes through to highlight a different mechanism that you talk about. So that's
Mhm.
pretty cool, I think. And I like the bit about ritual and transmission communities as well,
Mhm.
like highlighting that kind of the sociality of money. Like so, it's not just communication as itself; is also it doesn't you can see it as something it like float makes something flow something that a channel through which something flows, but also it has this own sociality, right?
Yeah,
Um,
and I think I mentioned the kind of sociality of officially sanctioned stories of the past that kind of
mm,
national currencies hold with it, um, and we might argue that as Eric Hellener, who I mentioned, also Emily Gilbert, another Canadian geographer, have argued that every act of using a national currency is an
mm,
affirmation of the nation state.
mhm,
Because yes, we're seeing, even if we don't really notice the kind of
mm,
iconography on the bills, but the fact that we only accept it and are willing to transact in it because we believe that tomorrow and the day after and the day after, the nation state or other authority that kind of authorizes and undergirds the
mm,
stability and value of that money will exist and perpetuate. So sort of every use of a money is imagining a future where at least
mm,
that money is stable. But at the
mhm,
same time, it would be very easy to tell a kind of like top down meaning flow, like I
mm,
use this money, therefore I believe that the US government will be here tomorrow. That might be
mm,
true, but
mhm,
it is also possible, even in that act, to earmark, as Viviana Zelizer would
mhm,
describe, and infuse that money with other meaning, some of which may run against those officially sanctioned stories, and some of which are become visible. So I think about the fact that under the Obama administration, there was this vision that the picture of President Andrew Jackson, who,
mm,
if you're not a U.S. history buff, you may know is like a genocidal maniac who is largely responsible. I mean, a lot of people are responsible, but who
mm,
has become a figurehead for Native
mm,
American genocide, replacing the photo of Andrew Jackson with Harriet Tubman, who was a
mhm,
abolitionist and active, brought many enslaved people to freedom. And so that was scuttled under the Trump administration, where kind of the redesign of currency in this way no longer was a priority. So
mm,
artists have created stamps where you can take the picture of Tubman and stamp it onto the picture of 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 Jackson,
mhm,
and remake that money to tell other kinds of stories, even if they're not officially sanctioned. So
mm,
sometimes those acts of remaking money are visible, and
mm,
sometimes they're not. Um,
yeah.
and sometimes we we may not feel that our use of any particular money is as meaningful,
Mm.
as sometimes cultural scholars would like us to believe, but at the same time it's kind of situated in a sense of the world in
Mm.
which using money is using particular forms of money makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And I like what you said a bit, going back a bit earlier when you said about stories. And I think you kind of like mentioned the word stories quite a few times. And I'm like, yeah, every time you mention it, I'm like, I really like it because I was just giving a paper about, it was more about storytelling in the world of cryptocurrencies and how people use memes
Mhm,
to tell stories about, the quite volatile crypto world. So I focus on
mhm.
uncertainty and possibility. But anyway, more going back to
That
what
sounds
you're
great.
right.
Send it
What
to
you're
me.
I will. More about, I like, yeah, this idea that, that's always implicit in your book about the kind of stories people tell through money is part of their identity as well, right? And that comes up quite a lot in your book.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, I think that, you know, um, yeah, like every money sort of the money that we use sort of tells us something about the systems that we sit in, whether that it has to do with national um, imaginaries, or kind of partial uh, sort of partial
Mm-hmm.
acceptance and partial citizenship in various national imaginaries. So it's pretty easy to pay with any currency. If you just
Mm-hmm.
have it, you can pay with it, but it's pretty difficult to get a bank account. It's pretty difficult to get paid across national borders still for
Yeah.
people. And yeah, so it sort of, the kinds of credit cards we qualify for tell
Mm.
us something about how we are seen and viewed by institutions.
Yeah.
um, and so kind of every payment instrument, whether it is a national currency of some
Mm.
kind or overlaid with a variety of other kinds of
Mm.
technologies, it says something about
Mm.
identity and something about the relational way that identity
Mm.
is produced, whether that's through kind of dyadic and um,
Mm.
relationship with people, or through larger imaginaries like the economy or the financial system or the
Yeah.
nation state.
And then, in your chapter on transactional identities, you talk about, I think is it in this chapter that you talk about having a JP Morgan Chase card?
Yeah. Yes.
I didn't know about that
Yeah.
one.
Yeah. I mean, this might be, I will admit, my book is sort of, is quite US focused and
Mm.
is quite, fairly, it looks mostly at US based phenomena, many of which are just not relevant in the rest of the world. So in the US, we have a highly tiered credit
Mm.
card system. Everybody had not, I mean, many people have credit cards of some kind. And if you don't have a credit card, you have a prepaid card or debit card. Um, and so the kinds of cards that you can access create dramatically different benefits and convey
Mm.
dramatically different benefits. So a Chase Sapphire Reserve is, you know, there's a lot of benefits like frequent flyer miles and kind of other points that you can use, really as money, to buy a variety of other things. It allows you to access first class lounges when you travel. It reimburses you for the costs of TSA pre-check. Which is in itself like almost a form of like a literal passport. So this ability to circumvent national security measures because
Mm.
you have this relationship to this card, and therefore you can do it for free. Um, and on the other hand, there are cards where every time you swipe it, rather than being rewarded in the form of um, you know credit
Mhm.
card rewards, you actually have to pay to pay. So prepaid cards have, you know can cost up to $1 per swipe, $5 per reload. So every time you put more money on the prepaid card, you have to pay.
Mhm.
If you if you keep it up month to month, there's a monthly maintenance fee. If you if you choose to close your account, there's a fee
Mhm.
associated with that. So it really is a situation where almost every card payment has either a benefit conferred or a tax uh, required. And so, despite the fact that I think I think one of the things that's most interesting about the Visa Mastercard system in the United States is that it allows us to kind of, on the surface, to to swipe a card and approve, pay for something, but under the surface, tremendous difference and networks of difference
Mhm.
are kind of activated, um,
Mhm.
that really do produce like differentiated transactional identities,
Mhm.
um, but that are, and of course, the costs of all of those rewards are built into
Yeah.
pricing, so it's really the poor who are paying, and paying for the rewards of the rich. So it's
Yeah.
just a, yeah.
It's
And
such a
so that's
crazy
like,
system. Yeah.
yeah, I
Yeah.
know. Yeah, and I guess in the UK there's, they're much more like debit cards and that sort of thing. But am I
Right.
right
Yeah.
that it is beginning to be this kind of differentiated, um, like I
I,
think it's called like the Monzo card,
yeah.
or
So I don't, I mean, there isn't this thing about credit cards from, it's more like, you'll have maybe a similar identity perhaps that's like it's kind of cool to maybe it's like it's cool to have a Monzo card or a Starling Bank card. It kind of
yeah,
says something about you, that you kind of like know what's going on. It's like taking care of your money is like a cool thing now, which someone pointed out didn't always used to be the case. So
yeah,
it's, I guess I haven't come across the more flashier thing, I guess, but I guess I don't have many.
yeah. What makes a Monzo card cool?
um I guess the reason why I got Monzo card was that you don't have to pay like a transaction fee when you like take money out when you're abroad and pay for things when
Uh-huh.
you're abroad. So that's quite nice.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because to me that sort of says, if you have a Monzo card, it means you're a person who's traveling all the time,
Yeah.
and you're a person who has that ability, and that's a very different kind of foreign exchange modality than you might
Mm,
see in like the remittance market, or the kinds of like financial products that are built for folks who are sending remittances
yeah.
globally.
Yeah.
So yeah, like
Yeah.
it's even something so kind of mundane has
Mm,
all of this, subjectivity packaged into it,
mhm.
and is an indicator of someone's like situation in the kind
Yeah.
of in modernity and relationship to modernity.
I mean, absolutely, yeah. I mean, they don't have like they only have one physical location building in London. I don't think, customers can go there. So it also says like, you have to be able to use the internet and able to troubleshoot through the internet rather than like, I also have a normal debit, like, a big bank card where I can just go wait in line and, meet older people there who are like waiting in the queue to like troubleshoot, find the problem. But I guess it also says about how, yeah, how comfortable you are with just using the internet and stuff like
Right, right, right.
that. Yeah. Okay. Cool. And you also talk about Venmo, which,
Also something we have
yeah,
is more US.
yeah, and that's good. And it's, it comes on in the later chapters, but it's maybe, of course, related to this. And it's
Hmm.
interesting the kind of, you talk about, the kind of stories that you can unearth through looking through
Hmm.
people's receipts and yeah, and this kind of like almost snooping. I think you begin the chapter nicely, like, trying to figure out how this person's broken up with their ex and they're trying to like look through their ex's receipts and figure out what's happening in their lives, whether they
Hmm.
have a new partner or something. Is that a thing that happens?
Oh yeah, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. So I mean, as I understand it, in many parts of the world, it's fairly easy to pay people, like pay
Yeah.
your friends electronically, or bank to bank. In the U.S., it's quite difficult. I mean, I guess you could give them cash or checks, but in terms of sending electronic payments that
Mhm.
move at the speed and scale of your text messages, or at the rest of your communicative reality, it's pretty hard. Like there isn't an easy way. And so, of course, there's been PayPal since the 90s, but it really wasn't, but nevertheless, for a long time, for decades, the idea of like P2P, person to person
Mm.
payment was this dream that many folks in the financial technology industry were chasing and imagining was going to happen. And there were
Mhm.
many attempts to make it happen. And one um, fintech consultants told me, after Venmo came out, they said,
Mhm.
who knew that all it would take would be, adding these little messages, making it social, making
Yeah.
it more like social media to get people to actually start using this. this person-to-person payment system. And I was sort of like, I could have guessed that, because it is true that,
Mm,
Venmo allows us to attach notes to,
mm,
basically all it is I send you a payment and then I have to write something or add an emoji, um, that annotates or earmarks in the Salazarian sense that payment. And it can, and so by adding that kind of social layer, or earmarking layer, it
mm,
it lubricates that kind of awkward moment of financial exchange between friends. So adding a joke, um,
mm,
that sort of thing. But it also creates this, unless you set your payments, as private, which it's public by default, like many
mm,
things in Silicon Valley. Um, Anyone, all your friends, and really anyone can see your stream of payments, and you can kind of, you know, almost all of my students report, going to Venmo because, that's where kind of the real truth of various relationships is to be found. So people are savvy enough at this point to kind of perform, um, their public identity in the way that they wish to be perceived on Instagram or Twitter or whatever, but they're a little bit less savvy, about the way that uh, they perform their identity on Venmo.
mm,
So, I tell the story. I use a New Yorker cartoon to tell the story of a breakup that occurred through
mm,
Venmo. So, one ex partner passive aggressively charging the ex partner for, half a couch and half a
mm,
cat and that sort of thing. But then you can trace the rebound. So this idea of like, oh, then it's margaritas with girls, then it's, you know shared plane tickets with their new partner. And so I think one of the things that, that we really that Venmo really reveals is the sociality of money and the
mm,
way that there are like poignant stories, that are to be told through our transactions. Um, but at the same time, it is pretty strange that Venmo is this kind of very public act of payment. And I think it's really interesting that most of the moral panic around this, which there's been, tons of articles in the U.S. and people talking in the U.S. about how how completely oversharing millennials and Zoomers are, and how this is just another example of how they have no sense of privacy. And even, on back, the stereotype of Twitter when it first started was like, oh, nobody cares what you eat for lunch. And now you're like literally showing what you paid for what you ate for lunch. And it's just the most like absurd, mundane overshare.
mm,
So like the moral panic seems to situate on people and seems to situate on why would anybody share this and why would anybody be interested in this.
mm,
Um, but it doesn't focus as much on the the fact that it's the, surveillance industry that benefits most,
mm,
from this. So it kind of,
mm,
scapegoats individuals when really it's, and like the kinds of prying that can be done by
mm,
friends and frenemies, rather than the kinds of prying that can be done by governments, by, insurance companies, employers, and that sort of thing. So
mm,
I don't think there's necessarily anything inherently wrong with creating publicity around the act of payment, um, from a social perspective or kind of cultural perspective. I think, you know adding meaning and flourish and various kinds of publicness to payments is something folks have done in lots of contexts for a long time. But I think, creating a new norm that payment will be public, um,
mm,
allows the companies that are the best at marshaling public data sets, such as
mm,
Palantir, which is like a PayPal startup, spinoff that is, creating some of the most powerful surveillance, platforms, for the CIA and the
mm.
FBI and, ICE and that sort of thing. So.
That's crazy. Yeah. And, you go on to later, talk about people in the adult film industry that are
Mhm.
also, used quite a lot in like, Bitcoin and the crypto world to like justify, one of the few things used to like say like this is to put forward a real use case for crypto as well.
Mhm.
But when you were saying about around Venmo, all these, I guess telling these stories also creates a level of sociality, but it also creates a community and a loyalty around something, maybe, which I find quite interesting. And I'm also writing about at the moment that a lot of crypto projects, they have community managers, right? Um,
Hmm.
and there's loads of different stories that people tell around, like like maybe Bitcoins, like Ethereum community or XRP community,
Hmm.
like they all have their own like kind of, XRP in particular has its all like particular unique
Yes.
kind of brand, right?
I
But
don't want
then
to say anything about
yeah,
it, so I don't have to hear
but
from.
but there's
Yeah.
but there's like other more niche ones with like a strong brand loyalty. And one thing I'm looking at is just how, yeah, and the stories being told within the space are important for them to keep using that network, and they kind of have has an effect on a visible effect on like the money that you're using as well,
Mm-hmm.
um,
Hmm.
which is quite interesting for me, I think. And
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely with the crypto communities you talk about,
mm,
um, using a particular money form is an affirmation of, as we talked about with the kind of
mm,
nation state, there's this like affirmation that you are imagining that or you're choosing to affirm, perhaps more consciously in the case of these crypto
mm,
communities,
mm,
that this form of money will be here tomorrow,
mm,
and that you're affirming your membership and kind of literally staking your claim, in the future of that community and your belief in it. And so, yeah, I mean, maybe when we use national currency, we're not necessarily
mm,
like claiming, decrying some sort of patriotism, although we are, you know, saying that we have at least enough trust in the particular um, currency issuer that it will be worth something tomorrow. But in these cases, it's absolutely um, an affirmation of saying, I am part of this community. I want to be part of this community. And
mm,
I'm shoring up this community
mm.
and its perpetuation, um, as I, keep using it. So
Yeah,
I
yeah,
think a lot about that.
definitely.
It's not in the book, but I think a lot about that with like
Mm.
hodling, which is
Yeah,
like, yeah.
yeah.
So like what, which is this idea that it's big in many crypto
Mm,
communities that you just like hold on and you ride the waves of the up and down of the fluctuating price. And that if you're a true believer, but also, I mean, true believer, it's kind of this weird mix of like nihilism and belief. But you you're holding out for the future when someday will be the right time
yeah.
to, or not, to kind of sell off your shares. But yeah, you're like
Mm,
what is the future that's being like hodled onto,
yeah.
and what is the future that's being summoned?
I mean, I think it's one of the most interesting ideas. It's For me, it's the most interesting idea in crypto, actually, hodling. So
Hmm.
I'm writing a paper at the moment about hodling, and gave a paper recently about hodling as well.
Oh, I would love to read that. Yeah.
It's about how it's fundamental, like why the crypto has stuck around, really, right? Because there's other products that have gone in the past that people compared to the tulip mania and things like that. The
Yeah.
things that lose 90% of their value don't ever come back. But thing with, like, cryptos that lose 90% of their value, they come back because people hodl, and people
Hmm.
have this belief. They believe in this, like, kind of, they're tied into this future, and there's this community built around it, and there's this moral valence surrounding this
Hmm.
term that means that, you know and you kind of talk about it, like, through brand loyalty as well, like, this kind of like real belief in this network. And yeah, so I mean, in terms of hodling, it's super important in crypto, I think. But
Hmm.
going back to your book, in the idea of
Yeah.
like
Oh,
loyalty.
I just want to
Sorry,
say
go on.
something else about what you said,
Yeah,
which is that, when so my next book project, or my current book
yeah,
project, is about scams, and I'm really interested
yes,
in, and just because I've been
yeah,
studying e-commerce and online
yeah,
economies and the crypto space for so long, I have a lot of
yeah,
outtakes about scams.
yeah.
But one of the things I think is so interesting is that with crypto, there's this kind of like rolling hype cycle. So if you know, like the Gartner
Mm,
hype cycle, which is this idea that, things reach a stage of, there's early adopters, and there's late adopters, and they reach a stage of hype, and then it falls off into this like trough of disillusionment, and then it's either goes away or just becomes domesticated. And I think one of the things we see with crypto is that that hype cycle, which I kind of look at that as a object of study rather than like a validated theory or anything, but this hype cycle keeps rolling. Like I'm constantly getting emails from journalists about blockchain hype as like
Mhm.
year after year after year after year, despite the fact that like the blockchain projects they're asking me about are like no closer to being a reality than the ones that were dissolved like on the last time that the journalist interviewed me. And they're always asking kind of the same questions, and it seems like like the hype blockchain and cryptocurrency never fully gets domesticated and never fully um, goes away. It just kind of keeps having this hype cycle over and over and over again, and it's a kind of strange temporality where it's like
Mhm.
always new and always coming and always tomorrow. um, and there's always some new group of people to kind of come in and sustain that hype cycle. So I
Yeah.
don't think all like altcoins or um, you know uh, d- decentralized finance stuff
Mm.
or any of that. I don't think they're all scams, but I do think there are a lot of
Mm.
scams and are a lot of pump and dumps, and
Definitely.
the same kind of temporality um, that allows it to kind of keep coming back is the same thing that enables the kind of scamfulness to kind of keep working. So, and then of course with kind of so my next project is really looking at like a history of the internet through
Mhm.
a history of internet scams,
Nice.
and then also look at the practices through which, or the mechanisms through which some forms of exploitation, some forms of capitalism are legitimated and some
Mm.
are kind of othered as scamful, and how those mechanisms kind of shift over time, and
Mm.
hopefully try to write about and explore some of my outtakes on all the all the
Yeah.
scams that I've seen over the last 10 years.
Yeah, there's so many out there. I mean,
Yeah.
it's interesting about the hype cycle. Yeah, it's kind of the almost kind of the part you can think of it as the functionality of crypto in some ways as well. Like rather than seeing it as an aberration, perhaps
Hmm.
as part of this thing that's going around that's like symptomatic of the time that we live in, perhaps. And
Hmm.
yeah, and so yeah, I didn't know that you were working on scams as well. So I'm just looking at my chapter titles in front of me, and some of them are like
Oh,
gambling scams,
great.
hodling. So I've been looking at the scams, crypto scams for last couple of years now. Just do
Yeah,
you,
I can't wait.
have you heard
Yeah.
of that podcast called The Missing Crypto Queen?
Oh yes. Oh yes.
Um,
Yeah.
So I've just been, I went back and interviewed some of the people there, and then I met that guy as well, Jamie,
Uh-huh.
because he lives in London. Yeah, and it's just such a mad world, isn't it? The
Yeah,
MLM
I mean,
kind of.
yes. Yeah. So MLMs, I mean, I was for the scam book, I was also really
Mm,
interested in MLMs because
mm,
MLMs have been around in the US anyway for a very long time, but they've taken on a whole new valence because of
mm,
social media, and in part because of the kind of remaking of the kind of transactional communities that I talk
mhm,
about in the book. Um, and it used to just be your the other people in your close circle that you had access to for this kind of network marketing scheme, but now our networks are so much bigger, and therefore
mm,
so is our potential downstreams, but also
mm.
it gets those networks get saturated much quicker, so we have kind of a
Yeah,
speeding up of the hype cycle around particular MLMs, which I think is really interesting. um,
yeah.
and I really want to study, I haven't gotten to the bottom of this yet, but one of the things I'm really working on is looking at the payment systems that undergird
Mm,
MLMs,
yeah.
because we do have in the US, we have a pretty complicated system for managing risk in receiving
Mm,
payments.
mhm,
And so I would think that MLMs are risky in the way that the payment system
mm,
defines risk, and I want to understand what kinds of mechanisms are allow payment systems to, or allow MLMs and MLM participants to take
mm,
payments at relatively low cost. Um, so, but yeah, and then so the missing crypto queen is so interesting because it's like MLM plus crypto
mm,
smashed together at last. And the
yeah.
thing I think is so interesting about that is that the whole idea that one coin is a scam is that
Mm,
there is no actual blockchain at the core of it. Like that's the
mm,
big reveal. That's like, oh, there's no
yeah.
blockchain, therefore it must be a scam. But
Mm,
to me, that's almost like totally beside the point. Like there's so
yeah.
many other scamful things about it. And like
Yeah.
most blockchain projects don't have a particularly functioning blockchain at the core of them
Mm,
either.
mm,
Like they're in development. So I guess, but this kind of performative act of like developing something that
mm.
probably will never really exist in the way that it's described versus not bothering to develop something but just kind of pretending that you are is what kind of
Mm.
is the mechanism that situates like a real non-scam blockchain project from a fake scam blockchain project.
Yeah. Yeah, it's so true. Like there are so many other reasons why it's a scam and so many
Yeah.
other reasons why it's problematic. And yeah,
Yeah.
just I've also been interviewing people in like one like scams and yeah, yeah, I went back and interviewed that guy Daniel as well, who's the guy from Uganda in
Oh yeah.
and so yeah, there's a lot of heartbreaking tales really in that
Yeah.
kind of world and how it like uses sociality and families to kind of
Hmm.
yeah uh, to kind of they really sell you with this promise of anyway we can get lost
Yeah.
in that road like so for quite I could just yeah it's something I think way too much about but so going back to like you were talking about risk in managing payments right
Mm-hmm.
and that comes back to your book about how and and I think it's actually my favorite part of the book chapter in the book you talk about in transactional politics
Hmm.
you talk about how actually it's this very it's the porn star I forgot her name Eden Alexander
Hmm.
and she starts a campaign right so maybe you can tell the story about
Yeah.
that yeah
Yeah. So, one of the things about my book that I really struggled with, but I think I was
mm,
able to find a relatively decent balance, was how much technical detail to include
mm,
about exactly how these systems work. And um, and so for me, there are it's really easy to tell stories about like bad technologies doing bad
mm,
things to vulnerable people because it happens all the time and it's a real issue. But I also wanted to dig deeper and tell like the kind of really interrogate the infrastructural reasons and
mm,
business model reasons why um, for example, this story happened. So like to kind of do a much deeper dive
mm,
and not kind of take the hot take easy way out. So it's a little bit of a challenge to also kind
mm,
of articulate that same level of technical detail in a conversation. So I worked really hard on the wording in the chapter, and
mm,
I encourage anyone who's interested to read it. But
mm,
here's the kind of messy version. Um,
mhm,
so there's this woman, Eden Alexander, who was a cam girl,
mm,
and who is a cam girl, and she had a medical emergency, which she had a very severe reaction to a common medication, and was hospitalized. And uh, in that in the aftermath of her hospitalization, she and some friends started a crowdfunding campaign on a now defunct crowdfunding platform that was intended mostly to raise money for medical expenses. So, because in the U.S. we have to
mm,
crowdfund in order to pay, basic medical bills, even those of us with insurance sometimes.
mm,
But as far as I know, Eden, didn't have the insurance to be able to manage her medical bills. So they started this crowdfunding campaign, and she's fairly popular. She has a lot of Twitter followers, a lot of friends on Twitter, and a lot of friends in the adult entertainment industry. And someone else in the adult entertainment industry retweeted her ask for the crowdfunding campaign and said, anyone who donates to this can receive a free pic set, meaning free pornography from me. And then Eden's account, her personal account, retweeted that offer. Um, and then suddenly, within a very short period of time, Eden got a bunch of emails from the crowdfunding website, letting her know that her account had been suspended for violations of terms of service, and all the money that had already been donated, so the thousands of dollars that people had already donated to her, had been refunded. And the reason they gave for this was that she had violated the terms of service, which prohibited any sales of pornography. Um, and and so she was, she was definitely very distressed and also mystified, and it created this kind of huge Twitter backlash, and eventually another crowdfunding campaign stepped up and said, or company platform stepped up and said, "Oh, we'll be happy to take your um, your business. We'll raise that again account. We'll raise these funds on your behalf." So all the people who had already donated had to now sign up for a new platform and donate again. And of course, most of us, if we were caught in the crosshairs of something like that, don't have an army of Twitter followers to defend us against these platform decisions, and create a PR disaster that may eventually help us. So the crowdfunding platform said, "Oh, it's not that we're trying to discriminate against sex workers, or trying to disallow people who are involved in pornography. It's just that, again, it's kind of this passing the buck. It's just that our payments platform, our underlying
Right.
payment provider, they say we can't take any funds. We can't manage any transactions for pornography." And then the the underlying payments processor said, "Oh, actually, we're not trying to discriminate. We don't have a problem with it. It's our bank that sits underneath it." So at every level, there was kind of this like passing the buck. And so what kind of the real story is that in the United States, as I mentioned, there's this idea that there's ways of managing risk in payments, and the payment system was not developed for individuals, for people to accept payments, to accept money. Rather, it was designed for businesses and merchants to accept payments. And every merchant is assigned a kind of a risk category. And what that risk means, is risk of chargebacks, meaning whether or not there will be a lot of customers who say they want their money back from the merchant. And the reason why that the reason why risk is imagined that way is because the bank that is accepting payments on your behalf is kind of holding the bag for the risk for your payments. So if everyone wants their money back, and the bank that is on the merchants, that is operating on the merchant's behalf, has to refund all that money, and then it's their job to the customer's bank and then to the customer. And then that bank, the merchant's bank, has to go after the merchant and try to recoup all of those funds from the merchant. So if the merchant is out of business or is fly by night, is truly scamful, that bank, the merchant's bank, may not be able to recoup the funds from that merchant, and then they're left holding the bag. They're left out of luck having to refund all of those payments.
Yeah.
So what that means is that there is a different merchants in the US pay different amounts of money to be able to access the payment system. If you are considered a high risk category of merchant, you pay more. If you're considered a low risk category of merchant, you pay less. If you have a bunch of chargebacks, your rate of what you pay for payments is probably going to go up. So I don't know if it's actually true, but all received wisdom in the payments industry is that pornography is considered a high risk industry. One, because there's a high rate of "it wasn't me" type of chargeback, meaning a spouse, a parent, an employer sees the charge for sees the charge for pornography on the bill, and then the person who made the charge says,
It
"Oh, it
wasn't
wasn't
me.
me." Yeah, right. And then they want their money back, and that's it. Or on the other hand, it is just true that internet pornography is extremely scammy. They
Mm,
are pretty misleading in their kind of subscription models. So
mm,
you might think you're doing a one-time payment, but
mm,
in fact you have signed up for a subscription where you're getting charged every week. There's
mm,
just a lot of kind of sketchy stuff.
mm,
So then all that is to say is that payment, pornography is considered high risk.
mm,
So, but and then I just wrap it up. I know this is like
mm.
super long, but
No, no, it's
is to
interesting. On.
is to say that in the Silicon Valley vision of
Mm,
payments, the main goal, as with everything in Silicon Valley, is scale, and
mm,
trying to get as many users as possible, trying to become the Facebook of X.
mm, mm,
And there isn't, and so rather than try to think about differentiated risk models, it's the goal is scale. So it's this kind of one size fits all risk model. And all of the things that used to be considered high risk get translated into the only governance document really Silicon Valley understands, which is terms of service. So the things that used to just be sort of differential categories become exclusionary categories. Um, and then those terms of service are enforced by automated kind of machine learning surveillance. So it's kind of like
mm,
this old model of how risk is managed in one context, and then
mm,
this new way of governing and enforcing violations of that governance, which is that it's like
mm,
Silicon Valley born. So terms of service and surveillance, machine learning, um, based kind of like banning. And there's a real misalignment between these two
mm,
models that winds up producing this very tragic case for the most vulnerable,
mm,
most
yeah.
vulnerable.
And it's yeah, and I mean, there's much more. You go into detail more in your book about about ISO and
Yeah.
PSP, and how that
Yeah, and just
works.
kind of
Yeah,
basically it's like, what does it
yeah.
mean? I mean, the real kind of heart of it
Mm,
is that there are lots and lots and lots of
mm,
industries, whether it's payment industries, or taxis that are, or everything in between, that are being disrupted by
mm,
platforms. And when those existing companies or existing ways of doing business get disrupted and are replaced by platforms which are always one size fits all and
mhm,
always enforced by terms of managed by terms of service and enforced by machine learning, there will be collateral damage for people who don't fit the mold of the
mhm.
kind of imagined user. um,
Yeah.
and when that happens in payment, the consequences are extremely dire, because
Mhm,
not being able to access the money that you're given is basically the same as not having any money at all. And it can it it's we're used to kind of being like, oh, well, I got banned from XYZ by accident, and I'll get my account back in a few days once they review whatever, like the kind of banning
mhm,
mechanism is kind of a rough, a very blunt instrument, but it's kind of
mhm.
all Silicon Valley knows how to do. And when you
Yeah.
apply that modality to payment,
Mhm.
it's just it's
Yeah.
really tragic. And
And
I
it's
think
scary, yeah. And it's scary how they just go through social media to kind of like, kind of figure out like how you're spending and what the kind of, again, going back to this idea of stories, the kind of stories that you're putting yourself, telling about yourself on social media, then, that kind of, that context that you say you create, like, kind of affects how suddenly whether you get paid or not. And I was also interested, maybe like a smaller point in this, which you talk about later, in the temporality of a transaction, right? And in this credit card system, I guess the transaction is longer, right? It's
yeah, I mean, I think that like I said, the book is like pretty situated in
mm,
US based financial services.
mm,
Um, and and I struggled with that a lot, to kind of think about. I mean, but at the same time, it's kind
mm,
of like you have to study something somewhere, and
yeah,
there,
yeah,
and I think like making broad pronouncements about how things work
mm,
everywhere in the world wouldn't be that useful. And there's very little
Mm,
interrogation of the U.S. financial services system in this way. But I do think that, and I also think that the U.S. winds up being, for better or for worse, mostly for worse, the kind of incubation site for a lot of tech industry practices. So, like I keep saying, Silicon Valley. I know there's
mm,
Silicon Valleys all over the world,
mm,
but it does kind of remain the you know primary center of the tech industry. And I think that the way that the tech industry is constantly imperial into more and more domains of life and trying to like
mm,
do better than whatever existing industry is, and at the same time like not really worrying about having to make a profit, like disrupting profitable companies with and replacing them with platforms that don't need to make money, just need to get to scale, and not really bothering to understand the intricacies of that system or who radical changes to those system hurt, especially when they're trying to get to 98% of the people and not worrying about the 2% who don't fit the mold, but then don't allow that 2% to have any recourse or any access to the system is like not unique to the US case, whatever the particulars of the reason why these these infrastructural breakdowns happen. Um, yeah, and I also think that it's important to think about automated machine learning based anti-fraud protection systems.
mm,
So, I'm similarly, people are in the same way that this adult entertainer lost access to their payment, lost access to being able to get paid because she retweeted a tweet that included an
mm.
offer for pornography. There are lots of other mundane examples of people suddenly losing
Yeah,
access to their
absolutely.
payment
Yeah.
platform. Yeah. So, like, I had a student who was the head of the Turkish Students Association who was
Mm,
running their annual banquet and collecting funds to pay for the banquet.
mm,
And they got all of this payment that came in, all these payments from their friends that said, like, had like the Turkish flag or said something
mm,
in Turkish. And just before the banquet, just before he was supposed to
mm,
pay, he got a note from Venmo that said, "Can you explain all of this Turkish stuff? It has been flagged by our
mm,
fraud detection system, not fraud detection system, but our detection
mm,
system that looks at anti-terrorism and money laundering. So if you can just explain why you're getting all of these Turkish flags, we'll be
mm,
happy to reopen your account in a reasonable time." And for them, a reasonable time is 30 days or so. But
mm,
this student, meanwhile, has no access to their money, and all their friends are depending on them to
mm,
pay for a banquet. Um, and the same thing happens if someone, I mentioned in the book, someone made a joke on their Venmo
mm,
payment that just said like Obama 9/11 NSA Al Qaeda latte
mm,
to pay their friend back for a latte, and
mm.
suddenly their Venmo account is frozen. And the interesting, I mean, it's so frustrating to look at these
Yeah.
examples, but the fact is that machine learning systems
Mm,
have to include false positives. That's
mm,
literally how they optimize and improve, and how a machine learns is by um, finding the contours and the edge cases of where they can
mm,
get it wrong, and then building it in. And so it might be corrected in the future, it might be built into
mm,
the model, but that doesn't help the person in real time, in real moment,
mm,
who falls afoul of it. And so these really shouldn't be seen as a bug in the way these
mm,
systems work. They are
mm,
fundamentally how these systems are designed to work. So,
mm,
and the context, the social context that these algorithms are trying to understand is always changing, and the algorithms themselves are always changing in response. And
mm.
it's just expected that there's an error rate, and
Yeah.
I think that that's really troubling when it comes to
Mm.
money.
Yeah. And in that, again, to like the temporality of transaction gets
Hmm.
elongated to like 30 days and
Hmm.
a month or like longer sometimes. And, there's a mosque near me here that had their payment, Barclays just canceled their account because of who you can send money to, what kind of name, people with what kind of names you can
Hmm.
send money to. And it's kind of crazy. So
Yeah.
it's,
And those
yeah.
temporality, I mean, that's a temporality that seems appropriate to the bank
Mm,
or to the fintech, but it
yeah.
isn't a temporality that's appropriate to for the rest of our financial lives. Like your landlord isn't going to say, "Oh, I understand that you're waiting 30 days in order
Mm,
to have your account problem
mm,
resolved." So we're part of all of these like interlocking temporalities, and when one that allows us to access our money is exceptional, then it can have
mm.
catastrophic effects on the rest of our life.
And it's also when you said about, that person, I think one of your students, they had to tell them why they're not a threat. That was
Hmm.
kind of sad. You kind of have
Yeah.
to you narrate your life in a certain way, and it's not the fact that nowadays that the stories that you're naturally telling about money, but it's also you have to sometimes tell stories in a certain way.
Hmm.
And I wouldn't even, I would think twice now about, I know for the last however long, I've always thought twice about, like, adding a joke like that. I would just be so scared at, like, I just presume I'm just being watched and everything's being
Hmm.
monitored. So
Right, and that's kind of the one of the main reasons why I'm so careful to make clear that I have no like
mm,
romanticized sense of community
yeah,
when I talk about transactional communities,
yeah,
but instead to say, that a community is um, it contains its own norms and expectations,
mm,
and we're building transactional communities in which it's normative, expected, and becomes reasonable to do that kind of self-censorship, or for some people to have to be obliged to do that kind of to comport themselves in ways that accommodate the whims of these kinds of technologies and the way that the technologies are produced.
definitely.
There's like a Foucauldian.
Yeah. And also, just before going on to the memories chapter,
Mm,
also, yeah, I think it's so important, to see what tech industries are doing. Like, we call it the Silicon Roundabout. We call it the Silicon Valley, the Silicon Roundabout here. That's the
hmm.
joke kind of name we give to Old Street Roundabout. And it's yeah, it's when you're disrupting, what are you disrupting, and also
Hmm.
what's going to come in its place. And Jane Gear talks about, so this is one why I look at like possibilities, like
Hmm.
all these possibilities are talked about, but then when we disrupt something, there's this moment of uncertainty, but then it feels like we've kind of recreated the same thing, or we've maybe not the exact same thing, but we've created the same power vectors or trajectories. And it's kind of maybe ties into telling Silicon Valley to have a understanding of, have a memory almost of what happened, or have a, rather than just seeing it as like a code exercise or a disruptive exercise.
Hmm.
It's yeah, and to see it as, yeah, it seems kind of unproductive. I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's hard for in the kind of startup mode of production, where it's either you become you start off as a startup and then you either go away, or you become winner takes all Facebook,
Yeah.
or you get acquired by a winner takes all. And you're constantly being asked to pivot as the whims of
Mm,
funders and venture capitalists require. um, there's there's very little way to kind of there are a few mechanisms to kind of learn from the past and have an institutional memory, and to yeah, it's there's a lot of lessons learned that get lost in an industrial system that is rapid and kind of like the temporalities of crypto in some ways.
yeah, and that disruption, like you said, it should really come with a sense of history and memory that,
Hmm.
that money does with.
Hmm. Hmm.
So maybe that's a nice segue into
Yeah.
money and memories with
Oh
Keith.
yeah.
I guess perhaps influenced by Keith Hart in his, like, idea of like the memory bank. And yeah, so what are you trying to do in this chapter?
Yeah. um, yeah. So, I mean, this chapter is it synthesizes a variety of different arguments that money is a form of memory, including kind of Keith Hart's idea. Um, and then also, economists and technologists who are not scholars, technologists who are not scholars, who have argued that kind of money functions as a form of memory, or as like kind of an exo memory, that's a meta layer of kind of like shared or relational memory. And I think, it does relate to this idea that that all money is kind of a distributed ledger in some ways. If we imagine that there's this like vast imaginary ledger that like is inherently memoryful, that says, oh,
Mm-hmm.
I have a dollar and I'm giving you that dollar, now
Mm-hmm.
you have the dollar, like that is an invisible ledger mechanism.
Mm-hmm.
And the token itself that I've given you, it remembers where it is, and I don't, it keeps track of itself. And I think, and so, the economists and such argue that money, meaning money that, or tokens of some kind, that move around and know where they are a suitable replacement for ledger type systems or memory systems. Um, and Keith Hart, makes a similar argument, but then elaborates on it by noting that the um, that money kind of carries with it all the sort of like moments of earmarking, and kind of sometimes remembers and sometimes forgets. um, and it's an interesting technology in the sense that it is able to carry with it traces of its past, while at the same
Mm-hmm.
time um, being like usefully forgetful in order to kind of create new moments of transaction. So I use that as a kind of pivot to, you know first of all, interrogate, like, from a media studies perspective, like what sort of media operates in this way, and kind of think about
Mm-hmm.
money as a media form, but then also look to, okay, well, money as memory is also being, um, it is also being the key kind of value proposition of like new Silicon Valley payment systems. So I kind of look, who are now attempting to be the stewards of our like newly social memory banks. So I look at the main paradigms of how that data is being used
Mm-hmm.
by, and I just take the example of Apple, Facebook, or rather Apple, Google, and then PayPal/Venmo, each of
Mm-hmm.
whom make the case that they will be different kinds of
Mm-hmm.
stewards of our
Yeah.
transactional data, and yeah, and kind of have different ways of understanding the value proposition therein.
So I know we're running out of time a bit.
Yeah.
So I wanted to wrap up with um, maybe more general question actually. So so why should we think about payment now? Like in this
Yeah.
kind of moment, have you had any like clairvoyant moment in like this COVID recession, like why we need to think about payment right now? And
Yeah. Well, certainly, I've been doing this project since COVID happened, where, in the book is very US focused, and it also is kind of individual focused. So it looks at like consumer financial services and how people, um, as kind of a, in their personal lives and personal financial lives, can access and use different payment systems. But like the scams, I had a lot of outtakes about like small businesses, and how small businesses are being asked to kind of use payment, or being disintermediate, or rather, how
Mhm.
small business services are similarly being disrupted,
Yeah.
and replatformized and repackaged. Um, and it is pretty interesting kind of thinking about MLMs and other
Mhm.
kinds of compulsory entrepreneurship moments. Like there's this
Mhm.
real blur between the personal and the kind of professional
Mhm.
economic lives in the kind of internet moment. So I was already, in addition to the kind of scam work, I was also
Mhm.
planning a couple of papers that look at how small businesses are increasingly conceived of and constitute themselves via platforms, whether that's
Mhm.
financial services platforms, payment platforms, lending platforms, but also platforms like Instagram and Facebook, and
Mhm.
review sites, but then also even platforms for space. So in the same way that there's like WeWork and these kind of like
Mhm.
platforms to do office space, so too are there increasing numbers of spatial platforms for small businesses, for hairdressers, for people who sell things. Um, so I and of course, in the there's a lot of work on the platform economy and what it means for like gig workers and what it means for people, but I'm interested in kind of like the small business as an entity,
Mhm.
and how that enters the platform economy. So in the case of COVID, suddenly all businesses, if they were to be in business at all, have to become online businesses, and like do these kind of curbside pickup and drop off. They can't have people in their business, so they go to the archives and kind of reconstitute themselves via this kind of historical memory of what
Mm.
business was once like on Instagram and that sort of thing, and kind of keep communicating, keep performing their existence via
Yeah.
platforms, and trying to eke out some business almost entirely via these kind of new online transaction systems. So I was able to do a bunch of interviews of small business owners,
Hmm.
and in these last 6 months, and just how they've managed this kind of COVID moment. And in the U.S. anyway, small businesses are valorized on both the right and the left for completely different reasons. So
Hmm. Interesting.
on the right as like this kind of bootstraps entrepreneurial American
Right.
dream, and on the left in terms of localism and anti-corporatism and that sort of
Mm.
thing. Um,
Okay.
so so they have been at the center of a lot of the economic
Hmm.
relief policy in the US, including the PPP,
Hmm.
which is the payroll protection program, which kind of launders a kind of unemployment benefit through employment via small
Hmm.
businesses. And there's been a lot of fintech involvement in the distribution of those funds. So I've
Hmm.
been really focused on that. Um, and and so yeah, I mean, I think we've all had to figure out, we've all, platforms, whether fintech or otherwise, have been really key to the way, Zoom, for example,
Hmm.
the way we live our lives in social distancing or quarantine.
Hmm.
And that has really like thrown into stark relief how important they are and how
Yeah,
dire
absolutely.
their instabilities are, whether it is for small businesses, which I've been focusing on now, or for individuals, which is mostly what I look at in the book. Um, yeah, but the yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I think that sounds super interesting. Yeah, just looking at small businesses as a like a unit of analysis during
Mhm.
this horrible time, and I'll be really interested in reading that when it eventually comes
Yeah.
out.